All right, societal collapse may be upon us, but here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. If this is your first time to this show, welcome to you. Everyone else, what's up? Let's all take a moment to have a breath. I don't know if you're listening to this when it is first being published or if you're listening to it at some point in the future. But if you are listening to this around the time in which it is recorded, I'm wondering, what's your anxiety level like right now? If you've been watching the news at all, I'm betting it's pretty high. I just checked in with the news before I came out into my backyard to record this, and I'm not even going to mention any specific events, but all of it on some level almost seems designed to make us feel fearful. Like the way everything gets presented, forget about the actual information and whether or not that's something that could be relied upon, but the whole manner in which the communication is taking place, it's trying to get our anxiety levels up. It seems designed to make us feel afraid. And there is absolutely a practice of turning away from it. I just put it down. I'm turning it away from it. And I think in the past, I used to think of that as putting my head in the sand. Like, how are you got to pay attention to what's going on in the world. Well, it's not that I'm not paying attention. I know, I got the headlines. I saw the news. It's that I'm not just going to sit there and take it in and take in the coverage, the 24/7 newsreel coverage, drip, drip. I feel like I was just talking about this, I think, last week, as a matter of fact, about setting boundaries with my eldest daughter and just setting these boundaries. Little small things are making the hugest impact for me these days. Little small decisions, little small changes to rituals, awareness about unconscious habitual behaviors, and not like coming down on myself and being like, you got to stop doing this. You got to stop eating sugar, and you got to stop, all that voice that says, you got to stop doing it or you're bad or whatever. But just an awareness of, okay, I'm going to put this sugar in my coffee, but you know what? I'm going to put half as much as I was going to put in. And you know what? I still enjoyed that cup of coffee with half as much sugar in there. Or little things like I've mentioned before, always putting my phone and my computer downstairs in this one place, way far away from where I'm sleeping, and having a ritual of that. It's made this huge impact. And that is very much a principle I remember hearing in a speech by Dean Ornish, which brings me to my guest today, Susi Amendola. Susi and I did not know each other before this conversation, but we share some mutual friends, as you'll hear. And she has written a book called The Centered Heart, which I've read, in which she talks about the work that she did in the Dean Ornish Lifestyle Medicine Program, as well as her experiences coming to yoga in an ashram and then working in a hospital and then opening her own center. She has a viewpoint that intersects with many of the themes that this show has been about since the beginning. And it was great fun to meet her and to touch base with her on what I was talking about, these simple principles that can be employed to help ourselves, even in the midst of larger chaos in the world around us, like the areas that we have some control over. the behavioral elements to our days that we get to have some say in. That seems to me very much what Susi's work is about. And it was perfectly timed with where I'm at. I've got all sorts of stuff I'm dealing with the new center and everything. Maybe I'll say something about that on the other side. But as I was saying, this conversation with Susi came right at the right moment for me, and I'm hoping for many of you. It was wonderful to speak with her, and I'm very glad to be sharing it with you today. Real quick before we get to that, let me mention that if you are enjoying what you're getting from this show and you would like to connect with me in other ways, there's plenty of opportunities for us to do that. I have on-demand videos if you're interested in yoga education or continuing yoga education. I have live classes and a discussion group. Or maybe you just want to get full access to the archives of this show and help support its continued production with a podcast premium subscription. All of the stuff that I do can be found at jbrownyoga.com. I do hope you will go check that out. Okay, I think that is it. Like I said, not feeling like getting into anything right here. I will touch base with you on the other side. I'll give you a little bit of a check-in on what's happening with the new center. If you're interested, you can stick around for that. Otherwise, I think that's it. We will go ahead and get to it. Let's listen to this conversation that I had with Susi Amendola. Hey!
So nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. I'm already recording. Let's just consider ourselves having begun. Is that okay with you?
Sure, that's fine.
All right. Very nice to meet you. I appreciate you giving me this time today. I've been looking forward to speaking with you.
Oh, I've really been looking forward to speaking with you. I've heard a lot about you from friends. So.
Oh gosh. Well, I hope it's
all
good things.
I think I first heard about you from Amy Matthews, who used to come here and do a lot of our trainings for us and our teacher training for about 20 years, and also from Nistila Devi. So, yeah.
Oh, but very cool. Those are two of my favorite people on the planet. So
mine too.
That we share them as mutual friends is a beautiful thing. And in getting ready to speak with you today and reading through your new book, The Centered Heart, I just immediately recognized how much you and your work intersect with a whole number of themes that this show has been about from the beginning. For one, I'm just interested to talk with you some about the Dean Ornish lifestyle medicine program that you were involved in. We have talked about that maybe once or twice before when Nishla was here, but I know you were involved in that, and I consider that to be a very significant thing. Even myself, having no connection like you guys did, but just reading about it and hearing Dean Ornish speak in like 2008 or whatever it was had some impact on me. To this day, some of those like basic principles that I saw were in your book for sure. And also I think and I talked about this with Nishla some too, kind of like since then, there is this kind of intersection between holistic practices or spiritual, the biopsychosocial spiritual part, and more like pure research evidence-based kind of bringing yoga into like a more Western medicine place, and kind of where that meets and where that seems like it has to part ways. And I know that's something that you navigate, so I'm always interested in talking about that.
Oh yeah, me too.
Yeah. Well, and then there's just a few other things about presenting yoga to the public now. And I know you work with teachers and stuff. So those are sort of the areas I thought we might get into. But before we get into that, you are also, in my mind, kind of someone who belongs to what I would call the first wave, in a way, of kind of yoga coming into the West. And we often talk about that in terms of the way yoga came into the culture, and everybody went to power vinyasa yoga classes at some point.
Yeah.
but it also is how it came into medicine, because that's certainly come, and then, you've played roles in that more. But I guess to start, a lot of folks who listen to this show, their first experiences of yoga was going to a group yoga class at a yoga center. And that was not your entrance into yoga. And I heard you speak about like the incident that kind of set off anxiety for you, and then the thing that changed it. Maybe you could share that. How old were you when that happened, and what happened and what changed it?
Yeah, thank you for asking. Well, when I was 15, I lived in the suburbs of Chicago on the north side, and I was 15 years old, and I smoked weed at a party. And it was really maybe my first time ever smoking weed, and I had the most terrifying reaction to it. I started hallucinating, and I had just terrible panic. It was almost like I was doing acid or something. And the weed wasn't laced. There was nothing. All my friends were there. And it set off this cascade of anxiety in me that lasted for several years. And actually, when it happened, I wasn't sure what was going on. And it turned out that I stopped being able to go to school. I couldn't sleep at night. I was scared when I woke up in the morning. I couldn't drive a car. I became almost agoraphobic. And at the same time in my life, my mom was sort of making her way into the world of health and healing. And she had found a yoga ashram in Illinois. And there was a Swami there, and she asked me to come to a class. And I said, okay, because I couldn't really do anything. So I went with her, and it was really just incredible what happened. I mean, I felt for the first time in maybe a year, I felt some relief. And so I sort of threw myself into it. And it wasn't just yoga. And I didn't really talk about this piece in my book, but there was also a clinic there where Dr. Rudolph Ballantyne, who wrote the book Radical Healing, he was a physician there, using yoga as therapy and using things like Ayurveda and homeopathy. So I was also treated at the clinic. And part of the treatment was being in yoga classes and regularly practicing yoga. So it was really the first time in my, since that incident that things had shifted for me, and I had felt relief and I'd felt some hope. And so that sort of led me, after meeting the Swami, that sort of led me to moving into an ashram and staying there for about 5 years.
Wow. Well, I mean, first, interesting to hear that, full disclosure, I'm someone who's used cannabis as a way to help me with insomnia and anxiety over the years. And that's something that's actually been helpful to me, but I certainly know others that's not the case. Yeah. And there are certainly incidents, just like with anything that we do, even certain breathing techniques, it's not for everybody always. And we can talk about that as well. Yeah. But interesting that it really sent you off in that spiral. And I'm curious about the Swami and that experience. And I didn't know that you also had kind of this clinical experience of working with a doctor who was also incorporating yoga. That's very interesting. I hadn't heard that part before. Mm-hmm. But the Swami, do you remember what it was? Why did going to the Swami seem to do something to, because I imagine your parents tried to help you in other ways prior to that as well. What do you think it was about the yoga context or the Swami that was different and that had an impact for you?
Well, first of all, in that era, in that time, which was the late 70s, there wasn't really any help for anxiety. So they couldn't really help me. There wasn't really anything they could do. And so, we could go I went to a doctor, but the next step was sort of like going into a mental institution. That was kind of what it was like. There was nothing in between. So yeah, they did try, but there wasn't really much help. And I think when I saw the Swami, there was something that sort of happened. Like when I saw him, I think I say this in my book, he looked blue, and I couldn't figure out why he was blue. First of all, that didn't make any sense to me. And then I said something to my mom, and she didn't register him that way. She didn't see that. And then he said some things to me, like I walked in, and the whole way there, I fought with my mother in the car. I was always fighting with my mom. I was 15, of course. And
I have a 14-year-old daughter. Believe me, I understand.
You get it. Yeah. I have like a 12-year-old granddaughter who's already starting it. And I'm like, oh no, here it goes. But yeah, so I get that. And she, she was just, we were just at each other's throats. And when I got there, the first thing he did was look at my mom and say, you need to stop fighting with your daughter and take care of her, or something like it was something very like, whoa, he saw it, he knows. So I just was really pulled in. And he also kind of knew for me, and he whispered in my ear and he said, and you need to listen to your mother. But he didn't let her hear that. He only let me hear that. And so it was like a really interesting, and then I listened to him speak, and it was, of course, nothing I'd ever heard before, but it resonated in a place really deep. It was something that I couldn't get from churches or, anywhere else I had gone, but it was something that I knew deep inside to be true. And I just felt like my heart just expanded. And I felt this sort of overwhelming sensation of sort of joy. And so I was crying when I was listening to him. So I think that it was just that meeting that really helped me sort of understand there was hope, and not just hope in the small world of what I was experiencing, which was pretty traumatic, but just hope in a bigger way, just a much bigger sense of hope.
That it was possible for you to feel better.
Yeah. And that there was hope for us as humans, and there was hope for, the world. It just felt bigger than just me.
And I'm sorry, did this Swami come from a particular lineage tradition? Was he associated with a certain school or tradition?
I haven't been saying it publicly just because I don't want to make a stink of it. But, but yeah, he was, and he was very well known. And, he had really made a name for himself in India and in the States. And he was in that first wave of Swamis that came to this country and set up shop sort of on the East Coast. So, along with some of the other centers like Integral Yoga and Siddha Yoga, and some of those were all sort of setting up on the East Coast there. And also Amrit Desai's place was there, Kripalu. So they were all kind of there at the same time. Yeah. So he was very well known, and people would sort of ashram hop back then. They would go from one to the next and kind of see which Swami was their Swami, right?
That's right. That's what I mean by the first wave. Like the first times people were getting into yoga was when these guys had come over and set up these ashrams in Pennsylvania or wherever they were. And people, that's where you went. It wasn't like there was yoga classes at the local gym that you would go to, that's where you went. And an initial Swami experience before you moved into an ashram, was there practices that you did that you remember, or was it just him talking and that resonating deeply, or what was the other things that you remember from that experience?
Well, there were classes happening at that institute. It was an institute because he had come to this country to do some studies with Menninger Foundation. So he was there showing them what he could do. So things like levitating a knitting needle and putting his heart in fibrillation for several
Really? They were like putting probes on his brain and he was making things levitate?
Oh yeah, it was crazy. Yeah, and they documented all of it.
Wow.
And there were things like where he would go into this deep state of meditation, everyone would leave the room, and then they would come back and he would recall everything they were saying in other parts of the building. And he was registering that he was in deep sleep. So he was the sort of first yoga nidra master that came to this country. And so, he was really something special at that time. Yeah. So he was well known, and so what I did learn when I went there was not just him. It wasn't just him speaking, but there were yoga classes that were happening. So I was going to the yoga classes 3 times a week, and they weren't with him. They were with, other teachers that he had trained. And then he also would speak once a week. He would do like what we would call now like Dharma talks, or,
right.
Yeah. Yeah. So they were sort of gatherings. Yeah.
I get it. All right. So then that seems to have a positive impact on you. Why do you decide to move into an ashram? And how old are you when you do that?
So I had been going back and forth to this center for a long time. And then they said, hey, I think you would be a great fit for this ashram. And I thought, great. I was looking for something. I had been doing things like helping in Montessori schools on the North Shore of Chicago. And I was, working, doing sort of layout art and doing all sorts of different things. And I didn't really want to go to college. I was still having a lot of anxiety. And so I thought, well, this would be great. And so I picked up, and you had to pay then to stay for a month. And then after a month, they would sort of review and see if you could come on more full time. And then they would pay you a stipend. So I did that. And then I stayed on, and I went there. And when I first got there, they put me like working with printing books or something. And it wasn't a fit. And then they put me in the kitchen, which was a real fit. And so I felt, I learned about Ayurvedic cooking from amazing Indian women. And I spent my whole time doing cooking and also working in the children's Montessori school.
I see. And the ashram you went with is associated with the same Swami or a different Swami?
Yeah, same Swami.
Okay.
Yeah, he had moved his whole thing out there to like a beautiful, in the mountains in the Poconos. It was very lovely. I mean, it was sort of magical in a way. And so for me, it was like going to college. It was sort of like going away to college because the rooms were like dorms. They were little, it was in an old, like a Catholic, what is it, like a seminary kind of place. And so there was like hundreds of rooms. And so people had rooms, and then there was a big, kitchen, eating area. So, and it was just beautiful. It was so idyllic. Like I hadn't been anywhere quite like that before.
Yes, I've heard you refer to the yoga you teach as ashram style yoga, which I know is referring to kind of like a lifestyle and mindset in a way.
Yeah.
And it seems to me like that's the formative place that you came to learn about yoga, or it worked for you, was in a context of a lifestyle choice that you had made.
Yeah. For me, it was really, and that was, what led me to Dean Ornish in a way too, was that it was about health for me and healing. For a lot of people that were there, it was about spirituality, which it became for me too, because I was a very spiritual kid. But it didn't start out that way. It started out as a way to get out of suffering. I was in a lot of suffering, and it was mental suffering and physical suffering and emotional suffering. And so it just really, it was like a way to work my way through trauma and come back to myself. So yeah, and I always talk about it as ashram style yoga so that people kind of get that it means, postures and breathing and relaxation and meditation and the whole thing.
And food and a whole, all
food,
of it.
Yeah. It was everything. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, how long were you at the ashram?
So I think it was somewhere close to 5 years. And then, of course, you probably know, and everybody knows, these stories of the Swami and, sexual misconduct started circulating. And my husband at the time, who I met there and married and had a child while I was there, was like, we're out of here. This is not okay. And I sort of went kicking and screaming. Thank God I went, because it was difficult, and it was a really challenging experience. But, it led me to Nebraska, where I live now, which is where my husband was from. My ex-husband is from here. And so, I felt really isolated when I got here because there was no community and there wasn't a lot of yoga here. There was an Iyengar teacher that was working here who I love very much. And there was maybe like a couple other people that had come from other ashrams that had set up like little centers around, but not like in their homes, nothing like where they had a yoga center or a place to go. So it felt like a calling for me to start something because I needed that. And I got quite sick. Like when I moved away, my lungs, obviously, I was grieving. It was such a hard transition to go from sort of this beautiful life where everything was, in community and there was organic food and gardens and then to come to Omaha, Nebraska, where they didn't know what yoga was. They thought it was yogurt. So it was very shocking to be here, but it really was, a call to start a yoga center. And, I did that when I came, and it was really, really changed my life. And I created the community that I really wanted for myself. It was sort of, obviously selfish. I wouldn't have done it if it wasn't something that I was going to love too. So.
Well, I appreciate all that. I know we're not mentioning it by name, but a little while back on the show, I did have someone who I believe was like directly mistreated by this guru that we're talking about.
Is that right?
Yeah, Vijay Hassan, the head of the San Francisco department, and I believe we're talking about the same people. I don't know how comfortable you are. I don't want you to have to talk about something you don't want to talk about. If you want to name names.
It's obvious where it is. I mean, it's the Himalayan Institute.
Oh, so okay. I thought we were talking about Swami Satchidananda, but we're talking about Himalayan Institute.
No, it wasn't integral yoga. And in fact, but I sort of bonded with some people from integral yoga over that issue. And I actually wasn't someone who was who was, affected by that sexual misconduct, but several of my friends were. And it wasn't it was at a time when coming forward for something like that wasn't believed. Nobody believed women then. Now people believe women, but it wasn't believed then. So it was really challenging to leave because they made it very hard for people. But it was all of them. I came to find out that there wasn't one ashram where that didn't happen.
I know. I mean, believe me, I've had people over the years, I've been doing this show for like 8 years, and it's just, I think in the past, I had conversations about it that weren't always so constructive because it was just like, so we were all just freaking out. The yoga masters were like raping people. It's like insane. And I think for a lot of people, it was huge because some people look to these gurus as like their spiritual guides and put them up as like godmen. And I mean, I don't think everybody did that, but
most everyone did. I mean, it was the guru-disciple relationship. That was what it was. You got a cold, it was guru's grace. The cold went away, it was guru's grace. Something good happened, it was guru's grace. Something bad happened, it was guru's grace. And there's something, I love that there's something about that kind of faith that is really beautiful. I mean,
and necessary in a way.
And necessary.
Yes.
So it was like, how do you parse out, how do you parse out the teachings from the teacher? And it was really interesting because the teacher always said, the Swami always said, like, don't do what I do. Like, don't follow me. I don't need followers. I don't want followers, which was really interesting because that made even more followers. People wanted, it's like Krishnamurti. Everybody wanted to follow him.
Yeah.
And he didn't want followers. And I think that, they had their own reasons for everything. And for me to be able to sort of trust my women friends and recognize that what they were saying was real and true. And then to also trust the teachings that I learned from a flawed guru, that was very challenging. And I think it eventually really hurt my marriage. And, we're also very good friends now, but I think it was very hard. It hurt a lot of my friendships. It was very difficult to sort of find my way back because the practices were what helped me. The practices are what saved me. Yoga is what helped me in my life in so many ways. And he used to say, like, take the practices and run. I'm like, yeah, you're right. That's exactly right. And in a way, it caused me as a teacher to be almost too like I wouldn't want people to put me up on a pedestal. But what I realized over time is that that's part of, like you said, Jay, like it's what people do and it's what we need to do in some ways to grow and to heal, is to be able to look up to somebody, look up to our mentors, look up to our teachers and have them act in integrity. And always they're going to knock you off your pedestal. There's always, I've taught teacher trainings for 40 years now. And, you get knocked off that pedestal so many times, but I wasn't even letting people put me there, which was, I think, hard for the relationship in some ways for people to have an experience of healing. So over time, I've gotten more and more comfortable with that. And also with when you get knocked down, it's just part of that process, and to just do my best to stay in integrity whenever I can.
I hear you. And it's interesting, I have had a number of episodes over the years where people come on to talk about these situations that have happened. As you said, in basically every one of the traditions that had these guru figureheads.
Yeah.
I haven't had anyone come on and talk about the Himalayan Institute. It is interesting that was your experience. I guess it's also interesting to hear you talk about how, as a teacher, you have looked to learn from that. I think one of the hardest things is exactly what you pointed to, how it's been very confusing for a lot of us to have these teachers who we learned these really valuable things from that continue to serve us and totally be true in a very universal way. And yet they also did things and behaved in ways that we couldn't condone. And trying to reconcile that has been super hard. And one of the ways I've seen teachers doing it is sort of a certain level of transparency and a certain way of relating to students that kind of mitigates an inherent power dynamic. We're not going to deny that you're facing this way in the class and everybody else is facing this way. You can't get around that, but a certain way of relating that's more mutual and friendship based rather than guru disciple based seems to have been a way that a lot of teachers like yourself and then me after you have been a way to kind of mitigate and kind of keep ourselves from letting people put us on those kinds of pedestals.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Yeah, I think that's really true.
And another way that people have responded to those experiences, it seems to me, is exactly how you did, is to say, okay, well, let's look at things through a more scientific lens, perhaps, or, through other lenses that are more objective, maybe, although we can debate that, but still like not subject to the same failings of the guru necessarily, although we could debate that too. But it's interesting. How did you end up finding your way to being involved in the Dean Ornish program? You said you moved to Omaha, you opened a center, which is significant. When does the Dean Ornish program come into it? Yeah, in 1993. So I had been teaching yoga since I got there in 82. I started 83. I started a yoga center. I got a phone call in 93, and I had been sort of struggling. I mean, I was, on food stamps. It's hard to be, it's hard to be a yoga teacher in 1983. Nobody knew what yoga was. Like you were saying, they would say yogurt. Exactly. I remember. Although we had, it's so interesting because we've gone through all of the phases of yoga. Like we were there at the beginning, and most of the people that were coming really for a spiritual experience. And then later on, it became all about physical postures. And now, again, it's for a spiritual and healing experience. It's really the reason I got into yoga was a lot of the reasons why people are getting into yoga now, because they're having really issues with stress that are just overwhelming for their lives and chronic illness. But I got the call in 1993, and I got a call from, I don't know if it was Dean Ornish. It wasn't Dean Ornish. It was someone that worked for him. And they had said, we're doing this program. I'm sure you've heard of Dean Ornish, which I hadn't. It's going to be, he's going to do a multi-center lifestyle trial with Mutual of Omaha, which, is an insurance company here in Omaha, very, world renowned. And they said, and we're doing a study and we need a stress management specialist, a yoga teacher. And I said, and in my mind, I was thinking, oh my God, there's no way I can do this. I mean, the medical world had really let me down in so many ways. And so I felt like it wasn't even in my mind a question whether or not I could work in a hospital. I absolutely couldn't. I thought there's no way. And so I said no, emphatically. Well, there wasn't really many people teaching. There was an Iyengar yoga teacher here, but they didn't want an Iyengar yoga teacher. They wanted somebody really who had sort of an ashram background. And how do you think they found out about you? I think they just looked up Omaha yoga, and then there's only like one or two places. There was like 3 places, and they saw. But then when they heard what I did, they were like, "Oh no!" So they had Nistala Devi call me, and I said to her, "Oh, I can't work in a hospital." And I said, "I lived in an ashram." She said, "Well, I was a swami in an ashram for 18 years." Yeah. And then she went on to talk about the situations that happened with women there, and we were like, "Oh my gosh, well, that's why I left." And they're like, "Yeah, that's why I left." She was like, "That's why I left." And I thought, oh my gosh, I think I might be able to do this. And so, but then I was thinking like, I don't know how, I thought about how, the world of yoga is really, the philosophy has to do with an internal locus of control. Like, and in the world of medicine, it's an external locus of control. In medicine, the doctors heal you, the medicines fix you, the surgeries take care of you, the nurses help you. It's all outside of yourself. And yoga is all inside of yourself, taking back, your own internal healer, your inner healer. And so I didn't know how those worlds were going to I had no idea, but I said yes to her. And then I sort of regretted it. And then when the hospital called me, because they're the ones who had to hire me, they said, we can offer you $7 an hour. And I said, no, even though I was on food stamps, $7 an hour sounded good. But then I thought, no, I don't really want to do this. So they said, well, what do you want? And I thought, well, I'm going to just say something crazy so they leave me alone now. And I said, $75 an hour. And they said, okay. And I went, yes. You went from 7 to 75 in 3 minutes? They lowballed you to the max. I know. I thought, and then I thought, oh shit. You could have said 200 an hour. And I said, oh shit, now I have to do it. And it was really hard. And every step of the way, like you had to do a P test. And I said, no, I'm not doing a P test, and they let me go, but they let me through. But it was sort of like all the things that I went through, the hoops that I didn't want to jump through, nowadays, that would never happen. I would have to do all the things to get in. But because I was their only option,
I was in a good position. I didn't even realize I was in a good position. So that's how I got in. And, and then I realized what an amazing program it was, because very shortly, after, I started seeing what happened to people. And I started seeing this team, which was really, just 4 modalities, and they were delivering this program, and the doctor wasn't delivering it. The nurse wasn't delivering it. It was the dietitian. It was the exercise physiologist. It was the yoga teacher, and it was a psychotherapist or the group support leader. So it was all these really cool, interesting people. And then we came together in team meetings to decide about patient care. I mean, that was incredible. And then we got insurance payment, and it was the first time yoga had been paid for as a prescription in the world of medicine. And I was like, this is really something huge. And then I would see people coming off their medicine, people that couldn't really literally walk 30 feet could start hiking again. I mean, people that I had a guy early on that they didn't know what to do with him because he was on the heart transplant list. So the doctor said, oh, just throw him in the Ornish program. This was in Omaha. Just throw him in the Ornish program. Set him in there while he's waiting for at least it'll be good for him. Within 6 to 8 weeks, he came off the heart transplant list. I mean, it was just
okay. So wait, let's use that as an example. So that guy comes in, he's like a lost case, just waiting for a heart transplant. From what I remember, I referenced this at the beginning of that program. I saw Dean Ornish speak one time at a conference, I think. And I always remember the main big takeaway that to this day it still has stuck with me was this idea of how very small little change, like lifestyle changes, can have this big impact. And it was like this metaphor of like, if you turn the ship's wheel just a little bit, you don't notice anything, but later the back end swings around. And that what they were doing in that program seems almost so basic, it's crazy. So if I recall, it was basically like 3 elements, right?
4.
4 elements. What were they? Can you tell us what were you doing in that program? What helped that guy turn his heart condition around?
Well, I'll tell you, and it is confound, like Dean Ornish always says, like if this program was a pill, it would be malpractice not to prescribe it. But because it's a program, a lifestyle program, people just don't want to do it. People don't want to change their lifestyle. And so it's a very hard program for people who have gone down that path and gotten to the point where their hearts are sort of turning against them, It's a very big shift, but it's diet. And the diet is it's close to a vegan diet, although there's some things like egg whites and non-fat yogurt that are allowed on the diet. And it's a very low fat vegan diet, which, most of the vegan diets now that you see are really high in nuts. They do a lot of cashew things and a lot of oils, and this did not have, and this was pre any, fake meat or any of that stuff that you can get on the market now for vegans. So it was cook for yourself, really. It was a cook for yourself, all vegetarian, low fat diet. And 10%, I think, are of total calories from fat. It's very low. No nuts, no avocados. Later on, he added in a few nuts a day and, some other things, but, no fish, no meat. And that was one element of the program. And then the other element was what's called group support, talking about your feelings in a group. And this is people think that's nothing. It's huge. I have watched people, like we would have people come into the program and we'd think, how are they ever going to get along? Like somebody who is so like anti-gay, everything. And then there's a gay man who's got all these alternative beliefs and they're in the program together and they become friends. How does that happen? But it happens through sort of these guidelines around how we speak with each other, compassionate listening, compassionate speaking about your feelings. And that kind of compassion is really key in healing. And so
even the idea that to heal your heart, you want to talk about your feelings.
Yeah.
That makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah. And also just having a feeling of community, even if you just knowing that there's somebody who would take you to the hospital if you needed to go. I mean, one of the biggest killers is loneliness. And that's a big, I know with my mother, after my father died, he lived to be 90, but, she ended up in heart failure 3 years later. And it was because her heart was broken and she didn't really have a big community. He was her community. And so that's the second part of the program. And the third part is exercise, obvious, but it's moderate exercise. It's interesting. People always think like working out at the gym and sweating really hard and doing all is exercise. But we know from Ayurveda, and I'm sure that actually marathon runners don't live as long as people who exercise moderately. It's just the way it is. Athletes don't live as long generally as people who exercise moderately. So it's moderate, like exercise that you love, like walking in nature, swimming, bike riding, dancing, whatever it is that you like that gets you moving. And it's really just 3 hours a week. So it's like a half hour a day and a day off. It's not a lot, but it's enough it changes all sorts of, like people's depression scores change rapidly in the program. So it's kind of amazing what it does. And it helps with joints, and it helps with attitude, and it helps with sleep. So it's all of the different modalities are really about reducing inflammation. So when you eat a vegan diet that's low in oil, low in meat, it reduces inflammation. When you talk about your feelings, when you get to know people in a different way, so you're not fighting all the time, it reduces inflammation. When you exercise, it reduces inflammation. When you do yoga, it reduces inflammation. So what started happening is we started seeing in the program that not just heart disease would reverse, but all sorts of chronic illness. And I started to really realize the impact that stress had on chronic illness. Like stress is like the major contributor. And now in all of the functional medicine programs, they're saying you need to mitigate stress, but nobody's telling people how. They're like, do some yoga, but they're not really talking about what kind of yoga do you do?
I know some people feel like, I've said this before, but it's almost as if they talk about stress like it's a lactic acid that you can just sweat out when you do a really hard workout. Yeah. And I'm like, I don't think that's how stress works.
It doesn't work like that. It doesn't work like that at all. And I think people think that if they have this ideal program where they're, exercising and sweating, or, people say to me all the time, like, I take care of my stress. I golf, I knit, I do,
play guitar or whatever it is.
Whatever it is that they say, but none of those actually address the nervous system. And I think that's, when doctors say you need to take care of your stress, and then people go to a class, like a didactic class, like there's some help in that. And some of those things like golf and, guitar, they help in the moment, but they're not a retraining for the nervous system.
I want to stop you there because I think it's a really interesting point that you're making, because I've talked about this in terms of yoga in the past with people where they say you can have yoga in anything you do. And I think that that's true, but not everything teaches you yoga. That I do think you can be playing golf and be totally stressed out and like not at all relaxing and feeling the oneness of life and healing yourself. But I also am someone who like is a yoga person who likes to play golf too.
Yeah.
And when I play golf, I have had it be this really, because it is a meditation. It is a kind of a place that you would potentially apply certain things, certain embodiment practices. And ultimately it does become a practice. You can have like a practice of yoga in golf. But to your point, I don't think that if you just go learn golf, you won't learn yoga. But if you learn yoga first, you can have yoga in your golf for sure.
I absolutely love what you're saying. Can I steal that from you and use that?
Of course.
I love that so much. That's so insightful, and it's so completely true. It's completely true. And I think that that's really what I started understanding was that, people don't have the basics, about how to retrain the nervous system and how to really mitigate stress. So they just go through their life. It just compounds. And, I know when people come to class for the first time and they do relaxation and they're like, I didn't even know that you could relax that much. I didn't even know that was possible to feel that unburdened. Right. And so I think that that's something that I felt was missing, is that for whatever reason, people look to yoga and they think, like our participants thought it was yogurt, but people look to yoga and they see people on the cover of magazines. I just did an article for Yoga Magazine. And of course, on the cover, there's still someone, in full splits or whatever. And, my article is all about heart-centered yoga. And I think that, you can do yoga in a way that brings you into doing, and you can do yoga in a way that brings you into being. And I think that, that more somatic kind of yoga, that more sort of listening kind of yoga is really where a lot of that training happens to mitigate stress. That kind of slowing down, listening, upregulating that sort of parasympathetic nervous system is really where, it all kind of, all the magic happens.
I mean, all of my friends, not all of them, but a lot of my friends who have been in yoga, like who I met back in the early 90s and are still doing it now, we have all seemed to move more in this somatic direction that you're talking about. And people are looking to different somatic movement modalities. And it's interesting to hear you say about how you feel like maybe there's more of a spiritual interest now, which we could get to. But I think that it's interesting to me that I'm thinking about, first of all, I'm curious how long you were working with the Dean Ornish program and kind of seeing how these kind of very simple principles, very universal, simple principles that can be applied in lots of different ways to meet individual needs can have these like massive impacts that, don't go accordingly to the protocols. And I think that's what I sort of noticed when I first was like interested and went to some conferences and conversations at the IAYT, that there was some people who were more like prescriptive, who were coming from more Western scientific modalities and bringing yoga into it. And it was like, we're going to get third-party reimbursement from the insurance companies. But in order to do that, when someone comes in, you're going to kind of diagnose what's wrong with them, and they're going to have a number. And then that number is going to have like a protocol practice that goes with it, because that's what the research showed. And then there were other people in the room who were way more processed, who learned at an ashram like you. And it was much more about relationship and other things. And like you're saying, much more like about mindset and like lifestyle choices. So you mentioned that early on, you didn't do the P test. You said no, and they let it slide. But I imagine that over time, that probably like clamped down on letting things like that slide. And I'm curious about why you left and sort of if that had played any role in you leaving.
Well, a couple things. I was just at the IAYT, the yoga therapy conference. I just spoke there just last week.
Okay.
In Phoenix, yeah. And a lot of people are really moving towards this more mechanical therapeutic yoga that isn't necessarily what I do or what I teach or what I understood. And so it was difficult because there was a lot. I did speak with a woman, Stephanie Munaz, who is a researcher in yoga, and she does a lot with arthritis and pain. And it was very interesting about the research. But, like I said, when I first started, there wasn't any research. We were the research. There was no research. And I would look for research for Medicare because we wanted to get Medicare coverage. And the only research there was Indian research, and it was spotty, and it wasn't specific. Like it wasn't like this practice of this, this, and this are what help lower blood pressure.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.